Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books in Miami, Florida, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Jonathan Meiburg and Jeff VanderMeer to discuss their newest books. Jonathan Meiburg is the author of A Most Remarkable Creature, The Hidden Life and Epic Journey of the World's Smartest Birds of Prey. In 1997, he received a Thomas J. Watson Fellowship to travel to remote communities around the world, a year-long journey that sparked his enduring fascination with islands, birds, and the deep history of the living world. Since then, he's written reviews, features, and interviews for print and online publications, but he's best known as the leader of the band Shearwater, whose albums and performances have often been praised by NPR, The New York Times, The Guardian, and Pitchfork. Jeff VanderMeer's newest novel is Hummingbird Salamander. He's also the author of Dead Astronauts, Born, and the Southern Reach trilogy, the first volume of which, Annihilation, won the Nebula Award and the Shirley Jackson Award and was adapted into a movie by Alex Garland. He speaks and writes frequently about issues relating to climate change. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of A Most Remarkable Creature and Hummingbird Salamander from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest to the virtual stage. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, Christina.
Welcome.
Good to be here.
Welcome.
Hi. Yeah, so hello, everyone. Thanks to the bookstore for hosting this. And I think we'll just jump right into it with me asking Jonathan some questions about his book. I'm deeply fascinated by birds, and the caracara is quite fascinating to me just because in the last year I've become more aware of it as there have been sightings in Florida in various bird groups that I'm part of. And I knew about the bird before, but it just has a strikingly, the variety that I saw has a strikingly kind of regal bearing to it. I never would have called it a false eagle. It just, yeah, it has this kind of like, already, you know, in the book, you make it quite clear how intelligent this bird is and how social in its intelligence. And I can see that just from the photos and videos that I've seen. So your book, you know, you had this challenge of 10 species of caracara adapted to all these different conditions in South and Central America and these inroads into North America. And they eat everything, you know. I mean, some of them literally eat everything, and some of them
species
prefer...
you saw in Southern Florida, there was one description of its diet, which was any animal matter, living or dead, which it can catch or find. And that's like not even a complete list.
Like if they were as large as some of the more prehistoric or post-prehistoric birds that you describe in the book as well, we would be in real trouble. And then some of them prefer to go after wasps that can sting them. So I thought, first of all, given the passion that you put into describing this bird in all these different conditions, how did you come to birds in general as like a hobby or fascination? And does your heart only belong to the caracara?
They were my introduction to the world of birds. I met them completely by accident. Christina mentioned I had this traveling fellowship after college where I went around the world for a year going to remote places, and I wanted to study isolated human communities. One of the places I went was the Falklands because I thought, wow, that place is isolated. It's geographically isolated. It's all the way down at the southern tip of South America, about 700 miles from Antarctica. And it's culturally isolated because it's this weird outpost of Britain. There's about 3,000 civilians there, about the same number of military. And it's if you're there, you don't hear any Spanish at all. And in fact, people don't even mention the South American mainland that's just 150 miles away. It's as if it just doesn't really exist. So that was that fascinated me. And I went there to meet the people who live there. But I quickly learned that the Falklands as an island group are much more complicated than I had ever thought. There are two main islands, but there are almost 800 smaller ones, some of which are so small you could walk around them in about 5 minutes. But this sort of garland of islands around these two major ones preserve versions of the ecology of that place that pretty much predate humans ever going there. And humans didn't get there until very recently, as it turns out, compared to almost everywhere else in the world. I mean, there have been people in the Americas for 15,000 years, but so far as we know, Amerindian people never made it to the Falklands and never knew they existed. And so the European first sealers and whalers and stuff who showed up there, and then later people like Darwin, and then the farmers who came in to turn it into a giant sheep farm, where their contact with the wildlife that was there was a moment of first contact with these animals. And go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just saying, I was fascinated by this whole idea of these like miniature arcs of undisturbed wildlife.
Yeah.
And I was curious, we've all seen kind of the windswept aspect of the Falklands from afar. I even follow an account of this woman who posts about the penguins there. But was there anything that really surprised you, or was there a disconnect between like your image before you went to the Falklands and what it was actually like once you hit the ground? I
had no real image in my mind. I remembered some very blurry images from when I was a young kid of the Falklands War. But all I knew is there weren't really trees there. And Darwin, actually, when he first saw them, just hated them. He had just come from Brazil, where he saw these forests that just entranced him. And he got to the Falklands. He said, it's one undulating moorland. There's nothing to see here, kind of. But there were things to see there, as he found out. Can I show you just a few pictures
absolutely.
here? Yeah. Let's see here. It's going to take me just a second to...
And you were saying earlier before we got on that you have some of the same fascinations that Darwin did about this place and about the caracaras. Yeah,
well, Darwin met these birds there, and this is the only contemporary illustration of Darwin aboard the Beagle that we know about. It was made in 1833, and you can see him in the middle of the figure here, and he's got all these objects that people are bringing to him, including this good guy's got a whole palm tree over here, and probably because he's going to pay him. This guy over here is saying the least I can get for these here is a tot, meaning he's going to get some rum for the seashells he's got in his hat. This guy's saying, I've killed a fine specimen of a flying monkey, shot 3 specimens of geese, and was very near being yaffled by a damn big bear. And you can look down his hand there. There is indeed what looks to be a flying monkey, and the ship's dog looking up at it hungrily. Now, this was before Darwin got to the Falklands, but he'd get there shortly thereafter. And sure enough, that's not the Falklands, but that's some islands that are kind of nearby. It gives you an idea of the scene.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful.
And just to orient you, here's the Falklands down here at the bottom of South America. And there's the Antarctic Peninsula just right over the way.
Love how you did that map, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
On its side,
we were trying to figure out how to put it in the book so that you wouldn't have a lot of blank space. So here's the main islands. Here's some of the smaller islands around to the side, though they're not all illustrated on this map. But the book begins in this place called the Jason Islands, and the 2 main islands there, Steeple and Grand Jason. Here is Steeple Jason, and it's really dramatic, kind of like Homeric looking almost. And that's my shadow in the front there. This is how close you can get to the wildlife. I took this with my phone, and there's a young striated caracara coming in to check out what these penguins are doing. There's some flightless ducks down here and other weird birds.
Yeah, flightless ducks. I did not know such a thing existed until I read your book.
They do. Yeah, giant flightless ducks. In fact, they're really mean. But here's an adult striated caracara. And my first impression when I saw these things is this a hawk or a crow or what? It seems like it's both. It turns out that they're falcons. And that the falcons, and we think of like peregrine falcons and merlins and kestrels, are as these little hunting birds that are very, very good at killing other birds, but don't have a lot of personality. These guys are quite different from that. Darwin noticed that they fill the role both in the Falklands and elsewhere in South America with different species that crows do in most of the rest of the world. It's sort of as if you built a set of crows on a falcon chassis. And but there are about as many of this species, which is the one that really hooked me because they come right up to you. And just sort of look at you as if this is another picture I took with my phone, as if they've got just as much right to be here as you do. Are you useful in some way, and can they figure that way out?
Yeah, and when you said that they're known as Johnny Rooks, right, to the locals?
Yeah, that's a name.
Yeah, I
from
mean
the
that made
old
me
whaling
think of
days.
like Johnny Thunders or Johnny Rotten, or it already gives me kind of an attitude, right?
Yeah, and it really suits them. It's easy to fall into calling them that, especially because striated caracara is just a real mouthful. But this is a typical of how they regard you. And this is not the way you think of wild animals behaving. Usually, they run away, right? Usually,
Right.
but these don't. And it gives you, it's like a door opens into the dream time almost. You have this sense of what it might have been like a little bit for the people who first walked into the Americas 15,000 years ago and found 2 entire continents worth of wildlife that had never seen a large predatory ape with fire and projectile weapons.
And I had a question about the captive ones in the UK that you talk about. I'm curious what you think of that in terms of a very curious bird that is adaptable, but then also needs a lot of enrichment, so to speak, in terms of being kept in captivity.
As falconers in the UK have discovered it, I won't describe it now, but there's a part of the book that talks about how captive striated caracaras got to the UK in the first place, which is a weird story.
That was fascinating.
It was all because of I think. Well, I've got a picture of them somewhere, but they're very different from other birds of prey in falconry collections. Falconers who work with them, you may have seen falconers, persuading a bird to fly to a glove for a treat or dive at a bait that's twirled on the line. Striated caracaras don't want to do that kind of thing. They want to play games, solve puzzles, have variety in their lives, hang out with you, be your friend. They're much more like parrots, which is interesting, especially because it turns out parrots and falcons are each other's closest relative. Falcons are not as closely related to other birds of prey as they are to parrots. So I wonder if you're sort of seeing this a little bit of the parrot falcon ancestor in the mind.
Yeah, that was another thing I didn't know until I read your book. It's fascinating to me about the book is that you managed to touch on all these different things just using this one bird as the through line. And you learn so much about natural selection and natural history and a lot of other things too.
What happened was that when I the first when I met these birds, I thought, what are these things? Why are they like this, and why are they here? And it turned out those are the same questions Darwin had about them, and he never figured it out. He went on to other things, but it was
because he wasn't as interested, right? Because he thought of them as like trash birds or just not worthy, right?
Well, he devoted as much ink to striated caracaras in the Voyage of the Beagle as he did to any other birds, more than to the birds of the Galapagos. In fact, this question just kind of eluded him, and in some ways, he couldn't have known the answer because he didn't know about plate tectonics, as nobody did at that time. So it's kind of it. But what happened was then trying to pursue these questions, this larger story just kept opening and opening and opening and opening. And then before long, I was immersed in the geological history of the continents and trying to figure out how all this tied together to result in this funny species of bird living only in the southern tip of South America. I mean, there's only about as many striated caracaras as there are giant pandas. Now there are 9 other caracaras, and there are more of those.
They're doing better.
They're doing
because they are so adaptable.
Yes.
And that I found fascinating too, is that they're found farther and farther north in North America, and not just by being off course, but the fact that things are getting warmer, climates are becoming more susceptible probably to them in terms of how they could adapt.
Well,
but I was
curious.
To be here. Yeah.
They
used to be here.
In the Pleistocene, they were here. They're in the La Brea tar pits with the ground sloths and giant camels and things. They're in Arkansas fossil deposits in New York State. But they retreated south when all the big animals died out here around the time that people appeared. Yeah. And then it seems like they're coming back. I talk some in the book about why I think they're coming back, but I think it's because we're providing them with food.
But another thing about the book, and you do talk about how they're called false eagles dismissively by some
Darwin called them
and,
false eagles who ill become so high a rank.
And then also just in general them being persecuted at times, or certain types of them being persecuted. So I was just curious, did you feel a responsibility to kind of reclaim the bird from villainy, or did that really kind of or not villainy, but just from circumstances of low birth, a bad rep?
Well, in the Falklands, luckily that's really subsided quite a bit. They're starting to be seen as an asset there. I have concerns about their overall ability to survive in a habitat that's islands. It's that they're only going to get smaller over time, and their prey species may move to places where they can't follow them. But In the rest of South America, the attitudes vary a lot. I mean, the Chimango caracara is a little sort of crow-like, sort of dusty brown bird that lives in southern South America. It's so common that in Argentina, there's a saying, "No gastes pólvora en Chimango," which is like, don't waste your ammunition on a caracara. It's just worthless. Right. And but like, the Inca emperors used mountain caracara feathers in their headdresses. This thing called the mascapaicha, which is the sort of ceremonial headpiece that Inca emperors wore, and only they were allowed to wear it. There are Andean caracaras that still have these traditions associated with them that make them, at the very least, kind of good luck to see. Like, it's good fortune to see a caracara. I saw a picture of one tied to the front of a bus that was dead, and it kind of was grisly looking. I thought, what did this bird do to deserve this fate? But then I realized that it was as a good luck token on high Andean roads. This thing's going to preserve you and keep you safe. Yeah. So people's reactions to them have varied a lot. I wonder a little bit if the people who came into came south into South America and then walked into the Andes saw kind of an echo of ravens, because there are no crows in South America, no big ones. There's some jays in the tropics, but there's no big black crows. And it was almost like maybe like an old friend kind of had returned to them in a new guise.
And I'm curious, on the one hand, your book is episodic in a good way, and yet it's also bound structurally by describing these different types of caracaras. And you also have these anchors like William Henry Hudson, who I want to talk about, this naturalist. Yeah. But did you have any favorite like nature books in mind, things that you had read that you thought were particularly spectacular when you were writing this book, or was that not the kind of influence that you had in your head when you were writing?
Well, some models. I mean, books I really admire. Of course, there's a lot of Peter Matheson's books I really like. Not just because he was such an incredible writer and with such range, but that he was structurally and formally inventive in every single book that he did. There's no two Peter Matheson books that are alike. I love the Snow Leopard, of course, like everybody does who reads his work, because of the integration of the personal material and the subjects that he's looking at. And he was very reluctant, I think, to put himself in the book, which I was reluctant to do also. Sometimes I had to, just because it's the only way to draw you in there. But I didn't want the subject of this book to be me, which is just sort of a pet peeve of mine. I went looking for something in nature and found myself. And no matter where you go, there you are.
Right.
And David Quammen's The Song of the Dodo I really admired. Remember that book? Really?
Yes, that's a favorite of mine as well. A huge favorite. So yeah, I can see that definitely.
And then the Alistair Graham's insane book, The Eyelids of Morning, The Mingled Destinies of Crocodiles and Men, from 1975.
Well, that I think I remember Eyelids of Morning, because I'm definitely going to have to pick that up.
That book's nuts. It documents a study of crocodiles in Lake Turkana in northern Kenya in 1975, which involved killing 500 crocodiles. And the photographer Peter Beard, who was this funny celebrity wildlife photographer who did the cover of Fleetwood Mac's Tusk also, and photographed the stones on the Exile on Main Street tour, does all the photographs for it and did the graphic. It's an incredible book. Anyway, sorry. Yes.
No. So, but I did want to talk about Hudson a little bit. He's a really fascinating person. Just in a nutshell, born in 1841, really had a preternatural sense of certain things that we see in animal behavior science today, in terms of looking at birds and other animals as individuals and being more, being smarter than at the time they were given credit for. So I'm curious, as someone, you gravitate to him so much in the book. I'm wondering, is he still on your mind, or is he kind of a question or an enigma that you've settled by writing this book?
Well, he my editor actually spotted him in my proposal, because I loved his descriptions of Chimango caracaras and mentioned that he seemed like he deserved a longer look. And my editor, to his great credit, said, "You should do that." So I started to read everything he had ever written, and I was just stunned by this person. When he's remembered at all, it's as one of the founders of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. But in some ways, he's kind of the opposite of Darwin, in that he was born in South America, grew up there, and then moved to England. And then he stayed there for the rest of his life. And eventually, he wrote novels. He made a living any way that he could. He was really poor for a long time. And he gradually started to achieve recognition for writing about the birds of the place he grew up, which is in the Pampas, the broad grasslands just south of Buenos Aires. And Alfred Russel Wallace, who co-authored the theory of evolution by natural selection with Darwin, reviewed one of Hudson's books in Nature, and that was sort of his first big break. But he was just such an interesting combination of things. He wasn't a scientist. He called himself a writer and field naturalist. And that's a title he pretty much invented for himself. That's the little chimango there that I was talking about.
Yeah, I like that image from the book too. So Hudson wrote this novel called Green Mansions, which you name one part of the book, one section, Green Mansions, and then you actually quote from the book. But I'm not sure you ever give us a sense of whether what the literary merits of the book. Is it of historical significance? Is it something that you would suggest readers seek out today?
There are people who love it. It's kind of a silly book, to be honest with you. With so much of Hudson's writing, Virginia Woolf said about him about one of his books that one does not want to recommend it as a book so much as greet it as a person. And that's really how I feel about him. I love him pretty much unreservedly. And yet, if you press me to say which single book should I read, it's very hard to say. His memoir of his early life far away and long ago, which was Hemingway's favorite of his, I think might be a good place to start. If you were going to start somewhere. But Green Mansions, which is set in southern Guyana, which is a place he never went to, it survived in popular culture somehow, to the degree that its main character, Rima, this mysterious girl who lives in the forest and has red eyes and can speak in the language of birds, survived as a DC Comics character. Even though she dies in the book, that doesn't seem to matter. She last appeared, I think, in 2016 somewhere, and was even in episodes of the Super Friends as a sort of forest-dwelling acquaintance of Wonder Woman who saves Batman and Robin from falling trees and bears and things.
So, since you have that map of Guyana up, you mentioned at one point that you stopped to savor on an expedition to in search of red-throated caracaras, which are the ones that eat the wasps. But you mentioned at one point that you stopped to savor the deepest part of that wilderness in a place where, quote, there's 100,000 square miles of unbroken forest all around.
Yeah.
And, because you're focused on the birds, I was curious what that moment felt like.
God.
And then also, is that the wildest place that you've ever been?
It's definitely among like the top three, I would say.
Oh, the top three. So what are the other two?
Well, some of the islands off the Falklands, there's an island called North Fir up there near the Jasons. In the Chatham Islands of New Zealand, I've been in a place called Southeast Island or Rangatira. That's way out there. But this was sort of certainly to be on a continent, not on an oceanic island somewhere, and feel that you were in a place where the wildlife was just absolutely off the charts. There were no people around anywhere. There's no roads. You could walk straight through primary tropical forest for hundreds of miles and never see a road, never see a person. But you probably get eaten by a jaguar.
Do you ever think you'd go back?
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah. I would dearly love to go back to Guyana. It's such a special place.
So I've got two more questions for you.
Yeah.
If and then if there's anything else you wanted to talk about, do you think there will be Johnny Rooks living in the Falklands in 50 years? 50
years? If I had to place a bet right now, I'd say yes. I mean, they were there 5,000 years ago, but the islands were bigger. They've started to pretty much saturate the habitat that's there, and it's really dependent on their prey, on the food. If the seabirds that they rely on, chicks and eggs of penguins and albatrosses and things like this, if those start to move off to other locations like the Antarctic Peninsula, they can't follow them. They can't swim. They can't drink salt water. So I really fear for them if that's the case, which is why in the end of the book I start suggesting that maybe we should actually introduce them somewhere. It's kind of a crazy idea, but we're going to have to think of some crazy ideas if we really want to save animals on islands.
Yeah, I don't know why, but that doesn't strike me as a terrible idea, and I'm generally kind of against introducing species, but for some reason I think that actually wouldn't be a bad thing. And besides Johnny Rooks, we'll just take them off the table. If you had to say, what is your other favorite species of caracara, and why? Well, the red throats, let you off the hook.
No, the red throats are really special.
The red throats.
They are just so unusual. They live in these family groups of multiple males and multiple females, 7 or 8 or 13 or 14 birds. They nest in giant bromeliads. hundreds of feet up.
I saw that. That was amazing.
Like yeah, there's a picture ahead in there. There's one. All these pictures are in the book, by the way.
Yeah.
So, but there's you see a young red-throated caracara looking at a human being for the first time. And Sean McCann, the guy with the giant spider in his face you glimpsed there, was the first person to document these nests.
Yeah.
And they bring them bits of wasp comb because they feed on wasps' nests.
Yeah.
And his research was trying to determine whether or not red-throated caracaras secrete a natural wasp repellent.
Which they don't. They're just really annoying to the wasps.
They're really annoying to the wasps, but they might use chemical technology in trying to keep parasites out of their nest. So it's just like that bird is like.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. I remember that too with the millipedes. Yeah.
Yeah. Weirdest bird.
It's kind of like in a weird way, almost like when they for a long time didn't think or thought Komodo dragons had some kind of poison, then didn't, and now they do again. It's like
I didn't. So it's just bacteria with them, isn't it? It's just like it's really gnarly and
it still has the same effect, but yeah, it's some kind of bacterial thing.
They just bite you and wait, and then you die.
But all of that stuff's fascinating, and the fact that they might these caracaras might defend their young with millipede secretions, right? Is that what?
Yeah,
it was?
they might. Yeah, I mean, and monkeys do, and lemurs.
Why don't we do that? I don't understand.
Well, it gets them high, so I mean, maybe we can come up with some new way to manufacture bath salts or something.
Right, exactly.
You go first.
No.
Well, Jeff, should we switch over to talking about your book here?
Yeah, sure. And please, people, remember to put stuff in the ask a question docket, and we'll get to that about I think 20 minutes before we end, so we can get to those questions. So quiz me. I've been on the road for 3 weeks now, so I'm ready for anything. Road. There's a hummingbird and a salamander in the book. I just want you to know that.
Well, I'm a little bit bound because since your book is first of all, your book is a thriller. And why did you want to write a thriller?
Well, I've written them before. I wrote one called Finch, and I read a lot of them, and I watch a lot of them, and I think about how do I translate this effect from movies and TV into fiction, because there's a lot of sophisticated techniques. So like there's actually a scene that's pulled right out of the True Grit remake by the Coen brothers. So there's actually a Coen brothers moment in there where people all start pulling out their guns and firing at the same time that there's an extended description of a hummingbird's migration. So hopefully I found the right tone to be able to include both things in the same book.
I loved that about this book so much, that it just operates on so many registers at the same time. And I also found it really funny in points that
good. Thank God.
They're kind of like a farce. Like the office politics, these sort of just very basic, ordinary office politics become extremely sinister somehow, and almost like a David Lynchian kind of way, where ordinary conversations acquire all this weight and terror.
And the antagonist. I once I realized that they were a little dramatic, I thought that'd be quite interesting. So when you really think about the antagonist, this hellmouth character and this wildlife trafficker, they're not very logical. But then I find that's a lot like people in life. So oftentimes I'm charting the points at which we think we're being logical, but we're actually not, which comes from a lot of government contract jobs.
I was going to say this, you sort of allude to this familiarity with sort of internal government workings. This came out of experience.
But science too, because my dad runs a lab, and I grew up with that lab, and I could see where the science ended and the personalities began. So
yeah, the politics become very intense. Now, I guess I should say that the question I had was that since fiction is it's like this contract between the reader and you, especially imaginatively, that there are sometimes in your books where you'll have an element that's fantastical or fantasy based. That there don't seem to be any of those in this book in general. It seems bound by the rules of reality as we know it.
Yeah, to some degree.
But when you get to a point where there's something that maybe isn't, why do you decide? I'm thinking there's a particular substance that appears late in the book.
Yes.
But we never see what that actually is or does.
Yes.
Why do you decide not to show that versus showing a thing like, for instance, like the last very memorable appearance of the biologist in Acceptance, for instance?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's always a question of where do you stop? Where's the right point where the reader is going to kind of take over in their imagination? The substance, without giving too much away, and I don't think it does, because there's a lot of stuff about bioterrorism in the book, was actually refined by the biologist Megan Brown, who created the hummingbird and the salamander. I hadn't even thought about including elements of those two creatures in terms of their life cycle into it. So that kind of gave it to me a little bit of verisimilitude, kind of anchored it in place. But
so you contracted with
go
ahead. You contracted with somebody to make two animals for you.
Yeah. I did. And in fact, she wrote them so beautifully that the actual text that's quoted in the book that supposedly Jane, the protagonist, finds when she's investigating this mystery because of the taxidermy she's been gifted with by a dead woman, just to give you the summary, it was so beautifully written. And I knew that one thing that Jane as the protagonist was going to be bound by or going to be entranced by was this stuff that she'd never encountered before about the environment. And there's in-jokes in there too that only a biologist could put in. And I didn't know about this until she and I started doing interviews together. And she's like, oh yeah, the name actually refers to this. And this way of phrasing this is an in-joke to this paper from this guy back in the day. So those are all things I wouldn't have thought of. But then also having it come to me fully formed and not be able to change it was great for the plot and everything. And also for that initial discovery moment that Jane has with material that I also had.
So it gives you something to push against as a requirement.
Yeah,
of the story.
Exactly. And I don't know if you encounter that ever as a musician or a writer, but it's really important to me to have constraints, because I think sometimes in the workarounds you get to some place that's more interesting than if you didn't have it. But getting back to your point about sometimes it's just in like the moment of the scene, the street level. Like I'll have an idea of what the novel looks like structurally and more or less what might happen, even though it might change when I write it. But when I got to the end, I realized that there was no point beyond that point. Just like in The Southern Reach, there's no point beyond two of the characters basically walking forward, throwing stones to see if the invisible border is in front of them.
Yeah.
But the thing about that too is that sometimes these things get continued in a totally different context. So the fact that there's a space there at the end for the reader, that means there's a space for me for some other novel totally unconnected to Hummingbird Salamander, where that scene gets completed or is the start of something. So
do you is this something that you think about, like, I mean, in the way that like David Mitchell does, where characters recur in different guises throughout his novels?
Yeah, in a thematic way, like there's something else I want to explore, not in a real way. Although I did have to put a little Easter egg in this book where, for those who have read Dead Astronauts, there's a blue fox who's kind of a rebel. And at one point, Jane finds a taxidermy family of foxes, one of whom is blue, on a mantelpiece. That doesn't mean these are the same universes. It's just I could not. You
couldn't resist. It was
indulge. It's not as bad as people who put like their friends' names into a thing, but I had to have that little tiny little thing in there. So
yeah, some things there's some things you just do in any work of art, I think, just for yourself.
Yeah,
and you go like, this moment is for me. And
and if someone sees it, that's great. If they don't, hopefully it doesn't impinge on their enjoyment otherwise, right? So
I remember seeing a church once, I think it was in Connecticut, where the most intricately carved surface, there was wooden carving all over it, but the most intricately carved surface was the ceiling, which was dark and you couldn't see it.
And you couldn't, wow.
The idea was that it was for the glory of God, But I think we call it, when recording, we call it that, carving the ceiling, whenever we're doing no one's going to notice.
What is something in music that somebody's not going to notice? Just like the way something was made, a sound was made, or
maybe like the sound source, especially if it's become a very unidentifiable sound, but it's actually your dog from a couple of years ago who died, and they're just like
that sounds like we did this anthology called The Weird, and the publisher ran out of money, so they didn't have money for the cover. So he took a picture of his plate of calamari and transposed it with a photo he'd taken on vacation of Notre Dame, and that was the cover of the book. No one knew that. They thought it was just some cool design that had been made.
That's like, I mean, Brian Eno said that once that people are always trying to hit this very expensive target all right in the middle, and he said my favorite thing to do is to fire the arrow and then paint the target around it.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that.
It's a good strategy. So one thing that's in the background of the book a great deal is the trade in endangered wildlife. Particularly in probably the most nightmarish scene in the whole book, where you were literally immersed in it. To what degree did you have to research that for this book? Was this something that was already a concern of yours?
It seems to me that as I get into my older age, I get extremely lazy and other people do things for me. So when it came to the wildlife trafficking, I felt like it was. I had done a tiny bit of research, but for some reason, given the flavor of the personalities involved, I thought this is like an atypical version of an organization that does this for several reasons, including one that I can't give away because of a spoiler. So I thought I will write it, and then I will have John Platt, who edits the Revelator for the Center for Biological Diversity, and is a friend of mine, read it through because he's written a lot of articles on this. And if I'm unlucky, something plot-wise will be totally screwed up because of what he tells me. But luckily, what he told me is that there is no set business model for wildlife trafficking. Often it is a subset of an existing criminal organization that sees an opportunity. And there's, of course, no business school, as far as I'm aware, for these kinds of criminal organizations. So in as much as there are details about wildlife trafficking in the book, John said, this sounds as plausible as any of the other things that I have seen.
It would conform to other kinds of smuggling.
Yeah, which is kind of sad in a way, you know. It's and kind of horrifying at the same time. And that scene I thought was really important for the tactile quality of it. I always think in novels about if there is a reason for a scene, otherwise, how can I get a reader to understand the importance of something or make them feel it viscerally? And that was definitely one point in the warehouse with the animals that I thought I can do something that actually lingers with the character too, because she's haunted by this throughout the whole rest of the novel. So.
Well, there were a number of points at which the novel reminded me of North by Northwest a little bit.
Oh.
There were sort of set pieces, like, you know, the scene with Cary Grant in the cornfield. It was they thought of that scene completely on its own. They just said, okay, how can we put this in a movie? Do you work like that ever? Are there certain images that you want to manifest?
I think it's just that, like, for example, once I realized that there was going to be a scene in a used car lot involving a sniper, I thought of this scene in True Grit where the Coen brothers do this amazing thing where people are watching on a darkened hill, and it's a moonlit scene at night, and two groups of horsemen meet fighting, or at least one's on horse, and you see it long shot in semi-darkness, which must have been lit amazingly. And so I thought, well, most directors would not do that as a long shot. They would do that as like some medium shot or some kind of interspersal of edits, and it would be totally non-memorable. So I thought it would be really interesting to have kind of a long shot scene like that. So I had been looking for an opportunity to do that. I'd also been looking for an opportunity to use this book about the fur trade.
That was I have a question about that.
Which is a real book that's quoted in the.
Oh my God!
It's called From Animal Land to Fur Town, and the quotes in the novel are actual. And to just give you one horrific idea of it, it's basically these animals all talking about how they love being turned into fur, and the whole thing is a propaganda by the fur industry from the 1930s. And I found it in a used bookstore in Minneapolis 15 years ago. And I was like, I both don't want this in my house and know that I will be using this for something and I have to have it.
God, I both like credit you for finding it, and I'm also docking your imagination for not having come up with it at the same time.
And then we had because the only thing that might be copyrighted still is the actual image of the cover. We had to actually come up with our own fake cover. And here's the second Easter egg I can reveal is the page that's peering out of this is burnt. Mm-hmm. The designer decided cheekily to make a page from Annihilation, even though it's completely meaningless. Its connection to the thing. But yeah, it's a real book. And so that's a good example of picking your spot. Like there were several novels, like even Dead Astronauts, where I could have potentially used it. But it only made sense here as kind of like the Sylvina is the dead eco-terrorist, and her journal quotes are one part, and this is like Sylvina's journal is the antidote to the horrifying quotes from this book.
Yeah,
so.
And she's sort of in a way, she's kind of the MacGuffin of the thing, because the book searches for her in many different ways.
Yeah.
How did you decide how much of her to find?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we were talking in an email earlier about how unlike you, I couldn't go on an expedition, so to speak, to South America. And even though I have a lot of experience with South American history and whatnot, even though Sylvina, grows up in Argentina, I couldn't really show that because I really felt like one of my tests is if someone from Argentina who's a writer could do this better, why am I doing this? So she's transplanted to the U.S. at a certain age, and has that background of this family that's very wealthy and kind of into heavy industry and things like that, and she's kind of rebelling in her activism. At the same time, there's things that I can pull from my own life that feed into that. So, for example, she becomes very sensitive to light and sound, and I am extremely sensitive to light and sound, and also smell, to the point where I can tell when I enter someone's house very easily if they're using any kind of chemical cleaners with any ingredients that really should be illegal in the U.S. So I just I have an immediate reaction to any of that stuff. So
has this been a long-standing thing in your life?
Yeah, actually it has. And the cleaner thing has come up. Like I once did a book tour where I stayed with friends, and I had to leave someone's house in the middle of the night because of it. But anyway, so I was able to kind of like channel this, this part into Sylvina's life. And that gave me kind of an in into understanding where she was coming from, that there was, again, this kind of thing that lived in the body that was the beginning of the activism. And then kind of chart things like Unitopia, the kind of environmental commune that she tries to start. That's kind of like her bourgeois idea of activism that kind of fails. And
that one was. It's very funny. It has that part I found very funny.
I'm glad you're finding this stuff funny, because there's supposed to be stuff embedded in there that is funny. There's observations that Jane makes, very pithy observations, and I think that I've been very fortunate with the reviews, but maybe it's too early for people to note the humor in this kind of dark eco thriller, but it's there.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely there. I mean, the character walks into this strange place and it says they're looking for the organic mechanic. Organic mechanic, yeah. This is going to get interesting.
Yeah, I have some experience with environmental organizations too. So anyway, let's leave it there. Yeah. But I think it's almost time to ask some questions. Unless you have a last question for me, I'm going to go to the questions because we have like 9 of them here. So.
Yeah, let's go into them.
Okay. So we'll start with one for, I was actually going to ask you this too, Jonathan. There's a question, were there other topics or elements you came across during your adventures that didn't fit into the book?
As I was telling you before this, there's that Bowie line where he says, I had to cram so many things just to store everything in there. It really felt like that. The notes for this book are extremely copious. So odds are if I couldn't fit it in, there's a note about it. Like there's one point where I have a long note about a poem about a wren that built its nest in a skull in England. There were a few things. I took an entire research trip to Brazil that does not end up in the book at all, because I felt like I'd already spent so much time in the tropics in Guyana that it was going to overwhelm the narrative.
So is there a Caracara 2 book in your future?
No. No. I'm about to pitch another book, but
okay.
But this is as far as I'm going to go with this group, I think. I felt a debt to them for almost 25 years.
Okay. So what do you consider the most underrated bird besides caracaras and hummingbirds, of course?
Jeff, what do you think?
Gosh, that's actually a tough one. For me, it's vultures in general, which are, there's actually a picture of a vulture and a caracara in your book. But I think especially ever since I went to a rehab center for birds and got to meet a black vulture and just saw how sociable they are, how intelligent, how they imprint on you, I just thought it was amazing. So
that's a very special species, and its range is actually increasing in the United States now. They do well around people because they're like us, and actually in the Caribbean, people call them Johnny Crows.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
That's
I don't know what
funny.
this Johnny thing is, but it sticks for some reason.
And what about you, Jonathan? Do you have
underrated bird? A great-tailed grackle, probably. Those things.
Okay.
Absolutely. In Austin, where I used to live, they're just everywhere. And anytime someone would come to town and they'd say, "What's that bird?" I'd be like, "Great-tailed grackle."
Bow-tailed grackles here are very underrated. They're very adaptable and kind of amazing. Okay, so a question for you both: can you recount a memorable moment where the natural world has overwhelmed you to the point of forgetting even briefly yourself and all the stuff of people? Jonathan.
Many, and actually there are quite a lot of them in this book.
Yeah.
In the forest in Guyana there, episode with the giant spider and with the sort of creek. There's a creek bed we have to go down to try to find a giant armadillo. It's sort of a side quest, and it's absolutely filled with spiders, tropical wolf spiders, Catianid spiders, and I've always been a bit afraid of spiders. So it was sort of like all my nightmares at once, and we were in there for a long time. So I definitely felt as if I were kind of having an out-of-body experience. But of course, I came out of there just fine. If nobody got hurt, it was the spiders are mostly harmless. But it was just it was such an alien world. It was nothing like I'd ever imagined I would see. So that's one for sure. Jeff, what about you?
Well, I've talked. I won't talk about it here, but you can find. I have an article in Orion magazine recently about the first time I saw a hummingbird in Cusco, and it's not the kind of thing I can really tell as an anecdote. It actually needed to be in an essay. Yeah. But I will tell you about the time that my wife and I briefly decided when we were in British Columbia on Vancouver Island to have a boat take us to this mountain island, and we're going to hike to the summit. And the forecast, unfortunately, was wrong, and it was going to rain and be muddy, which is important to know. The guidebooks had been very weird because one of them, which I later found out was old, said there were wolves on the island, and I only saw this while I was in the boat going over to the island. And the cattle that were supposedly docile were actually extremely wild and hostile. So we, at the ground level of this trail, we saw the bull coming towards us, and we just hastily started going up the trail. And a while in the trail, where it was already muddy without the rain, there was this thing growling at us from the side that was behind us slightly. So we're like, okay, we probably should just keep going forward up the mountain to get away from whatever this growling thing is that's not a wolf, but still is growling at us on this island that supposedly doesn't have anything that could growl at you. And about halfway up, it did start to rain. We were in a mode where we were both not willing to admit to the other that we should really retreat. So it was the most profound experience because, first of all, cedars were everywhere and the smell was amazing, and it was old growth forest, and it was just. But at one point, we lost the trail, but we thought we could see the marker up ahead. So we are crawling up this ravine of broken cedars, unwilling to admit that we should retreat, when it started raining and getting really, really muddy. And it was halfway up the ravine of cedars that I finally turned to Anne and said, "We need to go back." And she's like, "Oh God, thank God, Jeff, because I thought if I said that we needed to go back, that you would want a different wife." And I was like, "Thank God, I thought you would want a different husband or something if I said we needed to retreat." And so we went all the way down through the mud, and the boat was not waiting for us, but did pick us up right near dusk, and we got out of there and then had the best meal of our lives.
Wow.
And beer when we got back to civilization. So that's one example of a moment. So let me get on with some questions here. Okay, so sorry. Oh, yes, Jonathan. Of all the animals you talk about that went extinct in the mixing of the continents, which do you most wish was still alive now?
Well,
you don't keep a list?
Sure would be cool to see a terror bird. I'll say that much. If you go into the Florida Natural History Museum here, there's a beautiful mount of one just standing right there looking at you. These were tall, sort of almost ostrich-like birds with a great big axe for a beak that would run you down and stab you. Come to think of it, maybe I don't want to see that. The glyptodonts would have been really amazing. These giant armored lawnmower, giant armadillo things, just kind of like trundling, across the plains. And I would have loved to have seen that. I mean, there's at almost any point in the world, if you in the history of the world, if you could just be picked up and dropped there, your jaw would hit the floor instantly. It was just so full of life, of strange life, and has been for such a long time.
Yeah. So I have another question here. Jeff, we enjoy seeing pictures of the nature around your home. What's the most interesting animal you've both seen?
Ooh,
Jonathan.
You mean that we have in common that we've seen?
No. I just think that they mean in general. What's the most interesting animal? Maybe the most unique animal you've seen.
That's going to take. I mean, it depends. Like, amblypygids are amazing. Those are super cool bugs. Yeah, that Goliath bird-eating spider was really something. It had such a presence to it. It's the biggest spider on Earth. I'm just kind of tongue-tied because there's so many.
There's so many.
I feel so lucky to have seen so many of them. But you know, South America and North America, this is a big point in my book, are actually extremely different from each other. Geologically, biologically, they were apart for tens of millions of years. They only connected about 3 to 5 million years ago. And this exchange of creatures between them, called the Great American Biotic Interchange, is still going on. And we have South American animals here in the north. There are northern animals, actually more of them even in the south. I don't know where I'm going with this, but tapirs is what I was going to say. Tapirs are these strange things that look sort of like a donkey pig with a little trunk. If you've seen 2001, they're hanging out with the guys in the ape suits at the front of it. They're from North America, but they died out here and survived in South America and in Southeast Asia, where there's a Malayan tapir. And the same with camels. Camels are from North America, but they went south, and now we know them
never came back.
Guanacos and vicuñas, and then and went west and ended up there.
I think for me, it's a tie, just off the top of my head, between seeing dolphins unexpectedly in a freshwater canal at St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge, which there's that disconnect where you don't know what you're looking at first because you don't expect to see a dolphin, right? You default to that's got to be the line of like an otter or whatever. Your mind doesn't catch up with what you're actually seeing.
Yes,
it's really kind of fascinating. And in fact, that actually even happened to me in Australia the first time I saw a kangaroo there, because a flash of brown to me meant a deer. So when a kangaroo jumped out, I had this moment where my brain just kind of froze for several seconds.
Yes, I had exactly the same thing happen in Africa once, where I saw this thing in the road and I just watched it change from a dog to a plastic bag to a child to a baboon.
It's exactly what your brain does, right?
It's just really going scary. Like, what is it? And you realize, wait, am I doing this all the time?
Yeah.
And in that case, can I trust my eyes at all?
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's totally it. And the only other one is just I saw a Florida panther once, and it was at the end of a long hike, and I was, whatever it is, I guess upwind or whatever, where it couldn't smell me, and it just sauntered fairly close, like 100 feet, and then walked off the trail. And I was like, just standing there. There's nothing I could do, and it was a pretty amazing moment, because it's one of those moments where you just don't have any control over a situation whatsoever, which doesn't really happen in the wild that much, really. If you see an angry bird, it's not going to be the same kind of thing.
You're not usually in mortal danger from wildlife. It's extremely rare now.
So that was kind of fascinating. I don't think I was in mortal danger, but I didn't know that. My brain didn't know that at the time. Let me see what else I've got here. Eco-lit has become incredibly popular. Works of both fiction and nonfiction that explore the natural world. Where the heck did it go? Oh, okay, here we go. Do either of you consider yourself as writers of eco-lit? Is there a political dimension to your work related to the climate crisis? Do you think it's just by implication writing about a creature that's threatened, or?
Yeah, it seems like the conclusions are kind of obvious. I feel like like what's the argument even? I don't understand why anybody would say at this point, no, this is not happening. It's happening, and all we can do is say, okay, then this is going to happen. And I think that it may be that because as humans we can tend to get so stuck in thinking that things are always going to stay exactly as they are right now, whatever now is. Maybe one of the functions of writers is to try to just look a little bit into the future. I had to ask myself, there's a thing in your book that comes up again and again. There's a cruise ship that's full of climate refugees that just keep appearing in news stories. And I actually had to ask myself the other day, I was like, is that something I actually read about, or is that was that in the news, or is that in Jeff's book? So it may be that having this kind of imaginative function is part of that's what's helpful about it.
Well, that's actually something that's in John Batchelor's novel, The People's Republic of Antarctica, from the 80s, which is one reason I put that in there, is because since the 80s we've had novels that have been extremely predictive of stuff that's happening right now, the 70s as well. And it kind of just kind of irritates me sometimes, because this category keeps getting like rediscovered And then you wonder if it's actually making any difference if we keep rediscovering it and saying this thing is hot now or an influence. But if ever it needed to be an influence, it's right now. So another question was, Jonathan, can you talk about the next book project yet?
Well, it's funny you mentioned Antarctica, because I'm actually thinking about writing a book about the once and future life of Antarctica.
Oh wow!
Like a book that would not be about polar explorers or penguins or whales or how the melting ice sheets are going to sink all the cities of the world. There's actually a much bigger story to be told than that.
And the question was also what my next book is, and it's a book called Secret Life, which is out in. Sorry, a huge pileated woodpecker just landed on the tree outside of the. I'm not making this up. It's just like this huge shadow just came down past the window.
They're so cool.
I had to determine whether it was a bat or what the heck was going on. Anyway, so
can you see its face? Is it a male or female?
It's a male. It's just going up and down this tree right outside the window. We leave the dead trees standing for that reason as much as we can. We top them off, but these things are huge. They're bigger than chick. I mean, they're like birds of prey in terms of their size. But anyway, so the next book is actually out in September, and it's called Secret Life, and it's a graphic novel by Theo Ellsworth, based on my story Secret Life. And the best part of it is I got to be lazy again, because I gave him the story, thought he'd be interested, and I'd have to write a script, and instead he just gave me the finished, completed comic graphic novel back a few months later, having storyboarded it in his head. Just gotten it down, and I was like, great, I didn't have to do any work at all. Excellent.
Are you a visual artist at all? Can you draw or paint or anything?
I can I can do kind of interesting, bizarre, kind of primitive illustrations of monsters and bats and things like that. I did all the rough sketches for like Wonder Book, the writing book I had out, where there's all these diagrams. So most anything you see of that nature is something where there's some pretty pathetic, but still maybe mildly interesting outsider art. That's the basis for it. Let me see if I can find one more question. Has anyone got another question they want to add? Because some of these are just observations. I'll ask this just because it's funny to me, and I am a huge fan of Shearwater. But how long do we need to wait for Jonathan to write the soundtrack to a Jeff book, to which Jeff will write the liner notes to the soundtrack? Okay, that seems a bit presumptuous. But anyway,
I'm into it. I love this idea. Totally.
Well, I mean, I
gotta say, the soundtrack to Annihilation I thought was amazing.
It was,
because
and it
Jeff Van was so good.
Yeah, no, it actually makes the movie, because I saw the rough cut of like those final scenes where the two Portman mimes are doing this stuff, and it was much longer for one thing, which doesn't really work. It's more like a Harold Lloyd kind of thing, but definitely does not work without the music. Without the music, that scene just doesn't work, and the music is amazing. I actually write to that music sometimes, so.
That's
just like I write to Shearwater.
Super awesome. Jeff Barrow, who did the music for that from the band Portishead, and they're nothing if not an incredibly like textural band. Yeah. And his other band Beak is also super awesome.
Yeah, and he's quite a curmudgeon on Twitter too, which is very entertaining. So I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you so much for that. I don't know if Books and Books is going to come back on, but I really enjoyed that. Thank you, Jonathan, for writing such an amazing book. I really love it.
Oh man, Jeff, thank you. So here they are.
Oh right, thank you.
There they are. Look at that. Oh my God, they're beautiful.
Giant hummingbird, tiny caracara, giant caracara, tiny hummingbird.
So just reminding everyone, you just press the green button and you can order both of them and we'll ship them right out to you. And I just want to thank you both for a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure.
Sure. Yeah,
and then
thanks.
just to say, may you see a caracara sometime soon. I think that's how we should end. May you.
Yeah, they're in Florida, so it's possible to see them.
How come? Where? I've never.
More in the sort of in the savannas, a little north of you, but they're there.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both so much, and thank you to viewers everywhere watching for joining us, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Okay.
Thanks.